So hi everyone. So my name's Will Foulds. So I'm the managing director of Redstone Risk. I'll do a bit of an explanation about Redstone in a minute, and a little bit more of a talk about who we are and what we do. Um, I think the purpose of this session is it's quite purposefully sort of slide light. I think it's a bit of a sort of conversation. I think for Mark and I to have. I think the idea being that we want to try to give the audience and the community hopefully some practical takeaway points of our view in terms of how we can try to improve project risk management maturity within these organizations and hopefully increase profits. I think, as Mark said, it's also around trying to give risk managers and analysts, I think, probably the recognition that they deserve. And we'll draw on some of the research that we did over the last sort of year or two with the audience and so on. And hopefully people will find it useful. Just a very quick word on just who we are. So Redstone, we've been doing a bit of work with Safran over the last sort of year or two, but we're a reasonably small risk consultancy. There's about 7 of us in total. I set the business up 5 years ago. We work primarily within the UK defence sector, but also energy as well. So in terms of sort of civil nuclear and oil and gas, that's probably less relevant. I think what's more relevant is the ethos behind who we are is really the reason I set the business up in the first place. Was I'm a very passionate believer that I think risk management needs to be something that is genuinely useful. I think if we can't argue the case as to why what we're doing isn't useful, then I think we have to really question why we're doing it in the first place. And that might sound obvious, but I think it's a question we probably don't really ask ourselves very much, I think, as a community. I think if we're honest with ourselves. And I think risk management, in my mind, and drawing on some of the presentations I know like Hazel did earlier on, actually, that risk management doesn't actually need to be that complicated. And I'll probably upset a few people by saying that maybe, but I think it's actually, I think there's some elements of it that are relatively straightforward, and you can get an awful lot of benefit very quickly by doing it. And I think, we don't want to try and hopefully scare people off. And that's a little bit what we'll try and talk about today. I suppose the good best way of sort of easiest way of sort of framing this to kick off was Mark and I had a conversation, didn't we, about a year ago, I think it was, and we were sort of toying with this idea of how do you actually sell the benefits of doing risk analysis, because anyone can go on Google or read any sort of theoretical book, and you'll find lots of reasons why you should do risk management and do risk analysis. But actually, when you read them, a lot of them are very intangible. It's all well and good saying, well, we can make a better decision and we can identify our uncertainty. So that's all good, and that's all good stuff. It's quite hard, though, to sell that concept to someone, especially someone who might want to make an investment in risk management. It's actually quite hard to monetize that in any sort of way. And what you can see on the screen was a report that I did towards the back end of last year. It's available on the Safran website. You can also get the link through our website as well at Redstone. And I think the idea behind this was trying to give the community hopefully some useful takeaway points in terms of actually how you could try to improve maturity within your organizations and actually try to get that attention and credibility that you might want out of your CEO or another decision maker for that matter. And I think sort of get that sort of recognition. And what I'm going to try and do today is touch on an aspect that when Mark and I presented this back at the ProjCon Expo at Wembley back in November last year, there was an aspect of it we didn't really sort of touch on too much. We focused on a few aspects. And I think what I want to talk today is a little bit more around this idea of project risk management maturity and sort of thinking, well, what exactly does that mean? And we'll kind of step through some ideas. And I think the idea behind this, again, is very much trying to be want to be sort of helpful and give you guys some practical sort of takeaway points. I've only got a couple of slides, so Mark and I will have a sort of conversation with it as we go along. So just to sort of talk through a little bit about the process and where this came from. So when we were talking last year, we came across this journal article, and you can see it referenced at the bottom of the screen there, but we came across a really interesting, really thought-provoking article in the International Journal of Engineering Business Management. I'm sure all of you read it on a regular occasion. And it was really good in that what it did, it was one of the first articles I've seen that actually drew a very clear link between, and I think it was for a load of companies, I think it was based out in Indonesia. But what it did is it looked at high-performing organizations, and it looked at the complexity, or what it classes the level of complexity of all of the projects that they ran. And what they found was a very clear correlation out of hundreds of businesses and projects they looked at, a very clear correlation to those activities that had a very high level of project risk management maturity. And it went on to explain that in a bit more detail. And I would definitely recommend, if you've got some time, have a read through. There is some really, really good stuff in there. I think for any of those of you wanting to engage in that conversation at a high level within your businesses. There's some really, really good stuff. But it was very interesting because it started to draw on this sort of evidence, I guess, that high project risk management maturity, or what they'll class as PRMM, does actually lead to more profitable organizations. And it was one of the first times, I guess, that we've actually seen some of that really play out. In the report that I referenced earlier on, there's some values that are within there based on some work we did within our sort of consultants network and so on. So there's some monetary values in there and some quite significant ones. But I don't want to dwell on that too much today, because I'm largely just repeating what I said before, and it's not necessarily what I want to talk about now. But within the paper, I think a personal maybe shortcoming it had is it didn't really explain what it meant by high PRMM, or where it did, it might say things like, have they got a risk register? How often do you review your risk? Those sort of things. Again, all really good stuff. But actually, for me, it was they weren't necessarily really good takeaway points. And I think I've got my own take on what I would interpret as a high PRMM organization. And that, I think, is really what I want to try and sort of dwell on a bit today. So having my experience and talking to a range of other people, we're going to look at what exactly is high project risk management maturity, and we'll do a bit of a poll as well as we go through, but it's sort of what exactly do we mean by high PRMM? And then towards the end of this talk, we'll do a little bit of a talk around actually how can modern software help you achieve that PRMM? And clearly it's not just down to software, but software is a really massive enabler to actually achieving this high level of project risk management maturity. And as I said, the five that we'll talk about, there's 5 aspects we'll talk about in a minute. They're very much my own personal interpretation based on my experience and what I found. There might be elements that people might not agree with, or there might be bits I've missed out. Again, feel free to comment or ask some questions at the end, and we can certainly sort of have a play around with those. So let's just have a think about what exactly is, or what's my interpretation of high project risk management maturity. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce 5 aspects that I think are high PRMM, and then what I'll do is I'll get Mark to. It'd be interesting to do a little poll. I'm not going to tread on Mark's toes. I'll let him explain the poll, but I think it'd be quite interesting just to do a bit of an audience review of what people think of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fairly quickly sort of give an overview of what I mean by all 5, and then then people can do their poll, and we can go through in a bit more detail. But I'll come to you in a second, Mark. I'll just introduce them very quickly. So
I pushed the trigger too early. I thought
no, it's fine. No, push away. If people want to start voting, then you crack on. It's not a problem. But so just to introduce them very quickly, and then I'll hand over to Mark. So the first one is this all around, from my experience, the best performing organizations on project risk management are those where it forms a core part of the way that they do business. And you might think, well, that sounds kind of obvious, doesn't it? But actually, I'll give some examples and of where that really, really comes to play, and I'll come on to that in a moment. The second one is all around the inputs, and some of you would have seen sort of blog articles that we did, I think last year. Again, I think that available through the Safran website, really talking about the importance of data quality and data inputs and the credibility that can give within a tool. So we'll explore that in a bit more detail. We'll then talk about the way in which cost and schedule risk analysis, put my teeth back in, can actually generate that better decision making. So we'll explore, what exactly do we mean by that. The fourth one is all around profit, schedule, and cost outcomes being demonstrably improved. So this is looking at the combination of schedule and cost data, and there's still the surprising lack of it that people seem to do. And the final one is all around culture, and we'll sort of explore a bit more about exactly what do we mean by that. But Mark, I'll hand over to you to introduce the poll quickly.
Well, yeah, I think you've kind of done it for me. So the poll's been up for 30-40 seconds or so, and the audience is frantically voting. So I think as you've described or qualified what you mean by each of those 5 statements, it's given the confidence of the audience to go ahead and select any of the ones that that they regularly come across. I'm going to pause it. Yeah, pretty much. Okay, I'm gonna close the poll now. Thank you, everybody. So, and then share the results. So the audience was able to, because the question is, what do you regularly come across? So people may come across, different combinations of those. Real mixed bag, pretty even mixed bag actually. So plenty of people saying, yeah, it is part of the modus operandi, 49%. that people kind of tick that thing. 37% CSRA modeling is understood and trusted by the project team. That's good to see. Could be higher, but it's good to see. Also that they're routinely used to make better decisions, 39%. Again, we're obviously striving for more, but it's not a bad starting point.
Yeah.
29% for driving improved profit and cost. And I think that's really, so that's the weakest one. And it's interesting that your report directly gave people some ammunition to say, actually, you know, the opportunity of driving down cost and improving project profit is actually there if we can only reach this high project risk management maturity. And that's what the evidence says is the opportunity. So that's good to see. So basically a good opportunity for everybody here. And lastly, risk management culture exists and is valued, 56%, so about a half.
Okay, that's
Not
quite
bad.
good. I
Not
mean,
bad.
to be honest, they're quite interesting because I mean, we can touch on those a little bit in a moment, but it's quite interesting in terms of the profit and schedule and cost one actually being probably the one I think that you were saying scored the lowest. I think that's right, isn't it?
Yes.
I think that's quite interesting because it's the one that often we find isn't really done that much, and so I think in a way the results kind of back some of that up. So I think that's quite good to know. But what I'll do is I'm just going to sort of almost go backwards, and I'm just going to sort of dwell on these in a little bit more detail because this is sort of I think I suppose some of the aspects in the presentation I really want people to kind of take away from some of this. So when we talk about modus operandi, it's a phrase I suppose a lot of people kind of band around, and we think, well, yes, risk-based processes must be part of what we do. I think the key here for me is organizations I've worked with, those that I would say are very mature at doing project risk management, to those who actively engage non-risk people. Mark and I've often joked, and I hope as a community we can kind of joke with ourselves, that risk people are very good at making outputs very interesting to other risk people to look at. Unfortunately, not that many people in the business are risk people. They don't really understand that. And I think those who have really got it as part of their business process are those where there's groups of senior decision makers who can really engage with the process because it's using a language, it's using terminology that they really understand. And often that means we've sometimes got to tweak some of the outputs we might get to put it into a language that people understand. And I think it's about being able to actively engage and get the contributions of those people as well. I think you're on to a losing streak. I think if you're in the position where you're just generating outputs and you might be giving it to one or two people, they don't really understand what they're looking at, and you're maybe not presenting it in a way or a language that they really understand. And I think that's a really, really important one. I think that's what I mean by the modus operandi. It's actually you've got all of those people actively engaging and wanting to be part and wanting to contribute to it. The second one around the credibility, and I sort of touched on this idea of data quality. The thing here is it's not really just about data quality. So yes, data quality absolutely is important because we all know that the outputs you'll get, the old garbage in, garbage out. If the inputs going into the first place aren't that good, then clearly the outputs that come out the other end probably aren't that good. But I will use this phrase with a lot of clients we work with that we want to get their fingerprints on it. And this is around the fact that in highly performing businesses I've worked in, those where lots of people have contributed to the input data and have had some involvement in the running of the model, be that on the schedule data, it could be on the risk, it could be on the 3-point estimates, whatever. If they've had an active involvement in it, they are far more likely to believe the output that comes out of it. So the data effectively is a lot more credible, and I think that's a really, really important point. I'm sure there's probably many of us in the audience who have done a analysis and talked to or presented it to people, and it might be brilliant, it might be a great piece of analysis, but if they've not really been involved, it's very easy to just go, I don't really believe it, don't really understand it. And I think if you're in the position where they've been actively engaged in it in the first place, that is a really, really good place to be. And I think that's something I would massively recommend for those people wanting to certainly sort of push up the level of project risk maturity that people might have within their businesses. I'll come on to one in a minute that I know is very close to Mark's heart, so I'll let him chip in. But this is probably one that's very close to mine in terms of outputs being routinely used to make better decisions. And this is really around this idea of scenario modeling and scenario testing. It's very surprising how a lot of people or a lot of organizations will still create one model and they'll just assume that they're going to make their decisions on that project based on that one model. And clearly there's uncertainty in it, but effectively what you're doing is you're presenting one version of the future to someone to make a decision on. And actually there's many different versions of possibilities. And so it's surprising how many people probably don't see one of the real valuable elements of CSRA is that ability to take things in, take things out. What if we double it? What if we shorten it? What if we do this? What if we do that? And you'll hear the phrase of kind of what if analyses. It's something that, again, a lot of people talk about, but we don't really do that much. And you want to be able to present people almost a potentially like a menu of options. You want to be able to say, well, actually, there's a range of possibilities here. Did you know that if we did this, the likely outcome might be something like that? And I think that's really, really important. And I think we'll look at it in a minute in terms of the modern software being able to really enable that conversation. But that is incredibly important. Listen to people's suggestions. Get them on board, and absolutely use it for what it's meant to do, which is to present a range of different scenarios and a range of different options. Please don't feel you've just got to do a model and therefore it must be right, because there'll be lots of things you won't have thought about. And sometimes some of the most basic models are actually the best as well. So I'm gonna bring Mark in here just to talk about this, because we had quite a big conversation a while back about this whole idea of integrated cost and schedule models, and actually how important it is to bring the two together, have a sort of trade-off conversation. I know, Mark, that was a subject quite close to your heart when we were talking before.
It is, because one of the things I care passionately about is helping the risk community talk the language of business, right? Such that I do sometimes feel it's a little bit like this, that the risk community is sort of trying to push up and get more credibility, and it doesn't always, I've experienced, speak the same language. And I think this point here dramatically, it suddenly gets that aligned, because senior business people really care about delivery and money or profit. And so I think being able to understand which is most important to that in itself suddenly aligns the risk management community to the professionals.
Yeah, and that is a great question, because it really resonated with me, I think, when you said it before, in terms of which is more important. And we see it quite a lot, that people will run a schedule model and then they'll run a cost model, probably in a completely different piece of software, or just not at all. And yet sort of fundamentally the two clearly go hand in hand. And actually sometimes just having that conversation around, well, which one is more important? How can we trade off some of these mitigation costs to get a better outcome on our scheduled date? If we're honest with ourselves, do lots of people have those types of conversations? And it's surprising probably how many actually don't. That's a really, really interesting one. And I think the thing we also found was, quite often, using the old sort of 80-20 rule, sometimes 20% of your output result actually could drive almost 80% improvement on some of what you've got, and vice versa. And I think that's an important thing, is sometimes understanding you don't need to try to manage the hell out of everything. There's often some sort of fairly quick wins that sit within that as well, which is quite important. And then just to sort of come on to the final one, just in terms of culture. And of course, we'll all talk about, it's important that we have the right level of culture. And actually, the poll results were quite encouraging. Actually, a probably higher number than I was expecting. But it was really interesting to just sort of explore this in a bit more detail. And I think for me, and I think talking, in my role as a risk manager and a risk analyst, I think organisations that are really good at doing project risk management are those that really want to progress. I think they want to get better. They want to do this better next time around. And again, it's not just repeating the same over again. And I think what I mean by that is it's actually doing a comparison between what actually happened in a project and then against what we actually predicted through our analysis we thought was going to happen, and then trying to understand, well, why were there various things we missed? What did we get wrong? What did we estimate wrong? And so on. And then making sure that learning is then carried forward into the next projects. And I think it's a hot market out there for a lot of risk people. And I think people want to work for businesses who really take that seriously and really want to progress. And I think when you see those types of things being done, to me, that's a really, really sort of highly performing PRMM culture. I don't know, Mark, if there's anything you want to add on to there before I just sort of jump onto
I'll
the
underline,
final slide.
I have the luxury of talking to a lot of heads of risk, and you talked about the recruitment market as being so hot at the moment. And what's interesting is it's become a hot button. If you are an organisation that demonstrates you are on a journey of maturing upwards, that's where risk managers want to be. They want to progress themselves. They want to make a difference. And so in terms of attracting, retaining the best talent, it's great to have a journey like this. I'm going to make a quick segue because I've got some questions coming in. You mentioned on a previous slide that your report advocates a higher profit, and quick questions are coming like how much can we get? Is this worth doing at all?
So I
Can you
knew that
answer?
question was I knew
Okay.
someone would ask. I mean, there were so when we were looking at some of the sort of the evidence that we were talking to various people, we saw numbers that ranged on. Again, an important point. This was it was found that generally the more complex the project was, the higher the potential saving was. So, and on those very high PRM organisations and highly complex, there were, I think it was a range of about sort of 4 to, in some cases, 28% reduction in some of the costs, which is some really significant numbers. So yeah, there's some good evidence within there. Clearly, it's a very deep subject to get into, but anecdotally, there was some really significant evidence in there of
But
some real benefits.
that's super helpful because I work all the time with risk managers, heads of risk, and they want to improve, but they need the ammunition to say to other people, this is really worth doing. And I think that data that you've come up with in your report enables them to, it's not just them saying it. Here's a piece of well put together, data backed report that substantiates this is something worth doing. So thank you for that, Will.
That's all right, no problem. I'll just move on to the final slide I've got, and then we can take some questions in a few minutes. And some of these I've already spoken about, but these are just some ideas or ways in which modern software, such as Safran Risk, can really help to make this journey to, I guess, higher PRMM a lot easier. And I'm not going to go through all in massive amounts of detail, but the first one we talked there is around this idea of increasing output accuracy. And I used that phrase earlier on about garbage in, garbage out. I think the idea here is modern software allows you to spot errors early on very quickly. Either errors that you've got physically within the model, it could be errors within the schedule, it could be errors within some of your risk data, for example. And when we say errors, it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. It's just we can run some analyses quite quickly and get up and running quite quickly and easily spot those things that pretty clearly aren't right, or are causing a much bigger driver than really it should do, because maybe we've got the mapping on the wrong thing. So I think the idea there is it's about generating time for the discussions and the conversations that really matter early on. I think that's the point. So it's about eliminating all of that stuff early on you shouldn't be, and then generating much more time through the risk analysis process to actually talk about the things that really you should be talking about, that are really going to make a difference, rather than carry errors on in some of the oldest software far too late, really, and then they get hidden. To be honest, you can never find them. The second one around exciting the senior stakeholders is something I'm quite passionate about. Again, a big sort of part of the ethos of who we are as a business. But generally, we'll find if people are excited, you'll find they're much more engaged, and vice versa. And I think this really plays to a lot of the sort of highly visual, dynamic software that you'll get these days. How many people have been to risk reviews where someone will just print something out of a tool or an Excel spreadsheet or something? You've all got to sit and go through it or review it on the screen. Let's be face it, it's not that interesting. It's not that exciting. And I'm absolutely not downplaying the importance of the data. I think the point is, it's the way that we are expecting people, non-risk people, to engage with it. And if we present it in that way, it's not that interesting. I think the more visually appealing and interesting we can make it, you almost can't not want to get involved in doing it. Who doesn't want to? And I think that's a really important point that, again, I think is a real benefit but behind having some of the more modern software involved. Quickly comparing everyone's ideas, the idea here is really around that sort of scenario testing I was talking about earlier on, and the speed and the ability to involve so many people so quickly, and to make them feel that their voice has been heard. And that sort of touches on to the fourth point around, if people feel that they've had some involvement in it, they're far more, or from my experience, they are far more likely to act on the output if they feel they've had some involvement in the input. Otherwise, it's very hard just telling someone what they should do based on data that someone else has given them. And I think the more involved you can get people within that process, I think you get a much better outcome out of the end of that. And the final one, as Mark already touched on, is just this idea about sort of fostering what we call smarter cost versus time conversations. So again, rather than just listing all of your mitigations in a risk register, again, if we've got some basic cost data and we've got them mapped into a schedule, we can begin to answer, okay, let's understand where we need to be spending this money, and let's make some decisions based on where they actually sit within the schedule and what we can actually do about them. And again, it's surprising how those two elements often aren't linked. And sometimes in a project, there's good reasons why they aren't linked. So I'm certainly not sitting here saying, you must always do it. But I think there's definitely circumstances where you could quite easily do it, even at a relatively high level, because I pretty much guarantee that the output you'll get from basic models, either in terms of stress testing the schedule, or at least just looking at some of the outputs, will at least drive some sort of meaningful conversation about, oh, I didn't realize it looked like that, or why is it like this? And it's a conversation you wouldn't have if you hadn't done it before. But that, obviously, I've still got a few minutes to go, but that pretty much covers what I was going to go through. Mark, I don't know if there's anything you want to touch on
Yeah,
that side.
there's a question come through which I think I'd like to answer it. So two people have asked this in different guises, and it's what one is about explicitly how can we assess our PRMM
Yeah.
accurately? I'm going to answer that one if you don't mind. And secondly, there's a question like how do we always want to improve. How do we get started? And I think those two are kind of overlapping. What I'm going to say, because I'll speak on your behalf, if that's okay, Will. I know there's many different. I've seen many organisations try and use a variety of different tools out there to self-assess yourself, which is perfect. There's many different maturity models, and you can pick different tools, and you can assess yourself, and you'll come up with an answer, which is fine. What I would say to people is that there is an advantage in working with an external independent organization, because they're external. They won't be tarred with any political brush. And any answers are neutrally gathered, and the external consultant has the ability of having experience of speaking across many different organizations. I just say that because I know you will, in your own organization, have an offering. Others do too, but I'm just making the case for speaking out for using some of the external. It's quicker as well, by the way, because everyone's got day jobs to do, and cutting across many different departments isn't always easier when you're an internal person.
Yeah.
And then the second one is just about how do we get started? There's a lot of enthusiasm behind what you've said. What are your recommended first next steps?
I mean, it's a very open question, clears lots of ways. I know we made reference earlier on to some of the like sort of video articles and blogs. Obviously, there's loads of stuff. Again, I'm not just trying to promote both of our websites. Obviously, it's good places to start. But there is a lot of stuff out there. But I know, we've had new people start with us, and a good place to go is I know on your website, for example, there's quite a few sort of like short little sort of bite-sized videos and things on how to sort of get involved and learn a bit more. Resources like that are really good. I think we've got to be very careful. I think when people are trying to start, not to sort of bamboozle people with too much jargon and terminology that they're not going to understand that earlier. I think if you can sort of fundamentally get your mindset into what schedule risk analysis or cost risk analysis is trying to do, then I think that's a much better way to start. So I would try not to sort of maybe dip your toe in rather than trying to jump in completely to start with. It's probably the best way of trying to summarize it.
Okay, all right. I'm just going to finesse that. There's a document on our website which was written by David Hewlett. It's one of my favorites. It talks about the journey map to project risk maturity. What is particularly cool is it talks about what are each of the new things that you need to do from a people, process, and tools perspective, and what's the added business value. I know yours talks about it as well, but it's just another resource there that people can use. We're out of time, Will. That was fun. That went quicker than I thought. I should mention this. Your report. So I've made sure that people can access your report in the handout. So I'm not sure I've mentioned this enough, but everybody in your little control panel, there's a section called It's called downloads, handouts. Handouts is called. Click the little handout. There's a singular PDF. So all of the presentations, including Will's, you can get that. So that means you can revisit slides or share them to colleagues that you wish were here, and do that. And then each presenter is given his own recommendation about what you might want to do next. So in Will's case, you put your report. So thank you for that. That's how everyone can get hold of further information. Really appreciate that, Will.
No problem. Thanks for having
I think
me.
it's a great report. Thank you for explaining how the community can get good value from it.